The title of A.W. Binder's Shomer Yisrael will be immediately familiar to anyone who knows the Tachanun portion of Shachrit, the Jewish prayer service recited in the morning. Tachanun contains penitential prayers. The word itself is linked to the idea of God as chanun, or gracious. That is, with Shomer Yisrael and the other prayers of Tachanun, we pray to God to act toward us with grace. In my experience teaching Jewish theology, I often find that English speakers are more familiar with the idea of God's grace in a Christian context than they are in a Jewish context. But the Hebrew root chen is all over Jewish theology and woven into Jewish culture more broadly as well. It's where we get the names Hanan and Chana. Divine grace, in short, is the notion that God will treat us with kindness, with loving kindness, and with generosity, even beyond what our actions merit, even beyond what we have earned or what we deserve. In Jewish theology in particular, God is gracious. God acts with loving kindness to us, to Jews, in particular because of the covenant, the loyalty that God promised to our ancestors and that we inherit from them. The original Shomer Yisrael appeals to God's grace in a specific form, God's grace in protecting the Jewish people. Shomer Yisrael literally means the protector of Israel. The Jewish people is described in various ways in the prayer, but primary among them is the idea of the Jewish people as a remnant. A remnant. This idea draws upon the later prophets, who, along with their predictions of great tragedies befalling the Jews, describe a remnant of them that will survive. Shomer Yisrael is the prayer of survivors whose people have suffered great tragedy. And in describing God as the protector of the people Israel, the people's survival, that remnant's survival, is linked to God's kindness and grace. The people is also described as those who recite the Shema Yisrael, the central Jewish prayer proclaiming God's oneness, a reminder that even as they rely upon God, they are devoted to God as God is devoted to them. Their recitation of Shema sets them apart from all others and identifies them. By basing his Shomer Yisrael on this original prayer, Binder invokes a sense of Jewish history as a history of suffering and survival. But when we look at what he's written, we see immediately that this is not necessarily the prayer of a surviving remnant. This is a prayer written in a moment of suffering. From a bit of distance, Binder was in the US during the Holocaust, but he writes at a moment when the people remain devoted to God, but God has not come through for them. He writes, "Master of the universe, you are the eternal shepherd of the Jewish people. See how your innocent sheep are being slaughtered while they believed in you, while they hoped for you, and for your Torah and commandments and your holy name, their blood was spilt. Master of the universe, you must help now." Written during the Holocaust, Binder's words are a call for help. They are a reminder to God that the Jewish people rely upon God. The clear implication is that God has thus far been absent in this moment of great Jewish need. The Shomer Yisrael, the guardian of Israel, has been absent. This image of God as absent while God's people suffer terribly is one that post-Holocaust theologians will return to over and over again. For some, the slaughter of 6 million European Jews becomes proof of God's absence in an ultimate way, and they go on just about to denounce God. The theologian Richard Rubinstein writes that we must live on the assumption that God is dead and will never intervene again in history. The Shomer Yisrael is gone. At the end of Binder's prayer, he uses the language of remnant found in the original Shomer Yisrael prayer. Guardian of Israel, Shomer Yisrael, protect the remnant of Israel, the She'erit Yisrael, and do not destroy Israel, who proclaim, Hear, O Israel, who proclaim Shema Yisrael. These words appear in Binder's prayer in Hebrew, as they do, of course, in the original, while the rest of the prayer is in Yiddish. After the war, some theologians will find proof of God's presence in the fact that there are survivors, that a remnant remains. Despite the enormity of the loss, survival presents a glimmer of hope. The covenant between God and the Jews remains, despite the Nazi attempt to eradicate it. The theologian Eliezer Bergovitz emphasizes this idea and suggests further that even some of the Nazis' victims believed it too and recited Shomer Yisrael at the moment of their deaths. Finally, in the post-Holocaust period, there are many who talk about covenant as a choice Jews must make. Binder's prayer does not gesture directly in this direction, but we can ask, what do we gain and what do we lose when we choose to recite Shomer Yisrael in this moment, when we choose to identify ourselves as the remnant, as the believing and committed remnant? In the COVID era, the suffering and tragedy that we face come largely at the hands of a microscopic virus, not at the hands of other people, at least not at their hands directly. And yet the sense of powerlessness that Binder's Shomer Yisrael invokes still resonates. There are moments at which we wonder who or what will save us, if not God. In addition, particularly at this moment when I'm recording, at a moment when we can reasonably hope for the pandemic to recede, the language of remnant speaks to what it means to be a survivor. We are humbled and chastened by the degree to which this virus brought us to our knees, individually and as a society. As the surviving remnant, how will we rebuild? How will we move forward?
Ribono shel olam, help dein Volk Yisroel. Ribono shel olam, help dein Volk Yisroel. Ribono shel olam, seh unseren bitteren Pein. Ribono shel olam, das Gewein von dem armen Volk Yisroel. Ribono shel olam, Ribono shel olam. Du ein bigger Pastuk von dem jiddischen Volk, sei wie deine Schäferlich wärm schuldig ausgekeulet, weil sie haben geglaubt in dir, weil sie haben gehofft zu dir und fahre deine Teure und Mitzvahs und deine heiligen Nomen, sehr Blut vergossen, Ribono shel olam, Ribono shel olam. Jetzt musst du helfen. Weiß der Welt ein Zeichen, als du bist der Herr von der Welt, als dein liebstes Volk ist dein Volk Israel, als du bist immer gewesen und wirst immer sein, der Shomer Yisroel, der Shomer Yisroel. Shomer Yisroel, Shmor Sheris Yisroel, V'al Yovad Yisroel, Omrim Shema Yisroel.